Hello, welcome to St Mary the Virgin's Church here in Leake in North Yorkshire. And it was here in the year 1002 AD that the women of the village of Leake were said to have risen up and killed their Danish Viking overlords. And it was later here in 1852 that a mass burial was found in the graveyard here full of human bones. So we'll be trying to answer a few questions. Does that mass burial indicate evidence of the St Brice's Day massacre in 1002 AD? Or is it indicative of something else that was going on here? We'll also be trying to work out why St Mary the Virgin's Church is here in the middle of nowhere with the A19 running right past it. We'll also be looking at some of the features of the church itself and working out what they tell us about what was going on here historically, from the carvings outside the church and inside the elaborate, spectacular pews. So the answers to those questions and many more will be coming up. My name is Chris, this is Church Searcher, and I'll see you after the map. So this is St Mary the Virgin's Church here in Leake, and the word Leake is Old Norse in origin from a word meaning a brook or a stream. And if you look on the OS map, there's quite a few streams around this area. There's also the Old English word leke or lecan, which also means sort of a damp, boggy, leaky area. And there's lots of place names around this area which sort of corroborate that fact that this was probably a damp, boggy area. Not far from here there's the market town of Thirsk, associated with the real James Herriot, and Thirsk derives its name from Thresk, which is the name for sort of fenland or a lake. Up the road we've also got East and West Halsley. When you see Slee, S-L-E-Y in a place name, it's an island within usually fenland or bogland when it's an inland settlement. There's also lots of Norse, Danish place names around this area. So we've got Borrowby, which gets its name from Begby, which is a hill farm, B being a farm. Uppsal is a high hall, Uppsal, so like a mead hall, think of Beowulf. We've also got Felixkirk near here, so that's literally Felix's Kirke, probably a St Felix church named after him. We've got Cowsby near here, Kelsey's farm, and then probably most obviously we've got Danby Wisk, Danby being Dane's farm. So clearly in this area there was a large settlement of Danish Vikings who settled here as traders, as farmers, and you had the rise of that first generation of Anglo-Norse, Anglo-Danes in this area. But also prior to that it had been involved in the raids which sparked off the St Brice's Day massacre. Now the tower behind is the oldest part of the church. There's the tower and what remains of the nave, the oldest part, and then the aisles, chancel have been added on later. Now the tower behind dates to the year 1100, and you can see some of the cobblestones around the top with heads carved into them. But in the side of that tower you can see there's an Anglian cross which predates this church. So there's more than likely used to be a wooden church on this site, and it had the Anglian preaching cross there, which perhaps even predates the wooden church. It's been dated between 700 and 800 AD, so there clearly was a settlement here way back then, and then the church has evolved over the centuries on this exact same spot through all that period. Now the village of Leake was to the north of the church here, and it went through successive phases of destruction and rebuilding. It was wiped out by the initial Viking raids. Again, it was destroyed in the harrying of the north by William the Conqueror. After 1066, there was a big uprising here in the north, and the Norman barons went around burning villages and farms and fields, and it's actually mentioned in the Domesday Book as being waste. When we look up Leake here, it says, in Leake, Gamal had a manor with 3 carricates. It is waste, and there could be 12 ploughs. So essentially the land here had been already laid waste as a consequence of the harrying of the north in 1069, and when the Domesday Book was taken in 1086, the land was still unusable for farming. So interestingly, it was the year after the Domesday Book was compiled in 1087 that the land here was granted by King William II to the Bishop of Durham. And we know from the detailed written records it was between 1100 and 1135 that the new church, the Norman church, was built on this land. Now the area around here was quite heavily affected, not just by Viking Danish raids, but also by Scottish raids. 1314, Northallerton was famously destroyed, as well as a lot of the villages around this area. And it's not far from here, just up in the Hambleton Hills, 1322, the Battle of Byland took place as well. And the Scottish army, led by Robert the Bruce, marched down through Wensleydale, over the Vale of Mowbray here, and towards Byland. And after their victory at the Battle of Byland, they ransacked the area again. So the site of the village is just north of the church, and if you look on the OS map you can see all the lumps and bumps, and if you come on a good day with a low sun you can just about make out where the village was here. So essentially the church and the manor house, which is now a farm, are the only remnants of Leake as a village, and that's why the church is here on its own with the A19 flying past it. You might well have driven past here on your way north to the northeast of England and often wondered about this church. So just north of the church is this large open area, and it's here in 1852 that an excavation took place to put in a drainage ditch, ironically because of the damp, wet conditions around here, which you can see in the fields all around in the reeds and the marshy areas. So it's clearly still to this day a boggy, marshy, damp area. So as part of this excavation they discovered a mass burial, a pit full of human bones and skeletons, indiscriminately thrown in, not buried with any ceremony, or so it seemed. So perhaps it was thought this was finally evidence of the local tale of the St Brice's Day massacre. So there's a tale locally of the women of Leake who rose up in the year 1002 AD against their Danish Viking oppressors. According to the story, the men of the village here had all been slain by one of these Viking raids, and they essentially took on the women as their mistresses and slaves, their thralls. And we still have the word to this day, thrall, to be held in someone's thrall. You were basically enslaved to them, as it were. And so, inspired by the words of Aethelred the Unready, the king of England, there was an overthrow of the Danish Vikings in England, and it's said that it was the women here in Leake who each single-handedly overthrew their own captors, and according to the story there were 500 Vikings killed here. Now clearly from the place names around here there were Danish settlements, but the other bit of interesting evidence potentially is when you look at old maps which show where the excavation was here. They also name the sunken lane which goes around the back of the circular church enclosure here, and it's known as Danes Lane. So perhaps again evidence of the Danish population here, or perhaps even this Danish massacre. So to put this into context, there had been a relative period of peace, but it was around 980 to 990 you started getting more and more Viking Danish raids. And it was in 981, after the Battle of Byland, Aethelred the Unready, called Unready because that means he was ill-advised, Aethelred the ill-advised, agreed to pay the Danish Vikings Danegeld, a tribute to settle in the area and to stop harassing the land. And so that's when we had this first phase of Danish merchants, settlers and farmers coming in, intermarrying, and we had this first generation of Anglo Danes all around this area, as evidenced in the place names and evidence in the Domesday Book, with Gamal owning this land, and also the land at Kirkdale, which we've seen in a previous video with St Gregory's Minster. Now, as well as the Domesday Book, we look a lot at Bede's ecclesiastical history of the English people, but I've got another book for us today, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. This is a collection of Anglo-Saxon texts which gives us a really good insight into the Anglo-Saxon period. And this lists the various raids that were going on, ramping up through the 990s into the year 1000 and 1001, particularly in the south of England. There were more and more Danish raids down there in the south, whereas before they'd been up here in the north. Now, it was around the year 1002 that King Aethelred the Unready finally got to breaking point. So, in the Lord Chronicle, it tells us that in the year 1002, in this year, the king and his councillors decided to pay tribute to the fleet and to make peace, on condition they ceased from their evil deeds. The king sent Ealdorman Leofsig to the fleet, and he, at the command of the king and his councillors, arranged a truce with them, and that they should receive maintenance and tribute. This was accepted, and they were paid £24,000. Then, in the midst of these events, gave orders for all the Danish people who were in England to be slain on St. Brice's Day, the 13th of November, because the king had been told that they wished to deprive him of his life by treachery, and all his councillors after him, and then seize his kingdom. So it's in this context then that a lot of the Anglo-Saxon populations were said to have risen up against their Danish Viking oppressors, particularly in the south of England, but apparently, according to local story, also here in Leake. So, could this large burial pit that was here in front of me be evidence of that? Now, having been excavated in 1852, clearly they don't have the scientific resources that we have today, and apparently the bones that were discovered here have been lost to history. However, there was perhaps a bit of evidence that was discovered close to the pit here, which could point to another historic event, because there were coins discovered close to the context of the mass burial here, which date to the reign of Edward I, Edward Longshanks. So, possibly the theory is that these bones, rather than being from St. Brice's Day, could have been from the Scottish raids in the 1300s. It's just up in the hills ahead of me here, where you had the Battle of Byland, 1322. There was the Scottish raids, 1317, 1314, around this area. So perhaps this mass burial were of people who were slain in those raids, or perhaps in the battle itself, indicated perhaps by the coins being found close by. Alternatively, it's been postulated that this could be a plague pit. We are in a churchyard here, but you do find plague pits in churchyards, and of course you can notice here that there aren't any burials that have been cut into that pit subsequently. Alternatively, again, it could be that it's simply burials from the rest of the churchyard that have been dug up and placed into one pit together to create space for more burials in what is a restricted burial ground here. So, lots of theories, no real evidence other than the place names and the coins here. So, possibly St. Brice's Day, possibly also the Scottish raids in this area. Now, we'll go around the front of the church and we'll see evidence which perhaps links us to what was going on in this area at the time and through the medieval period. So there's actually 4 sundials in the walls of St Mary the Virgin's Church here in Leake. There's one just above the porch door, which still has traces of the metal gnome on, which has been used to cast the shadow. That's the more recent of the 4. There's another just above the priest's door on this south-facing wall. Also on this south-facing wall, we've got these 2 blocks of stone that have been clearly reused from an earlier building. There's a big medallion with an animal carved into it on the right, and then the sundial on the left. And it's been suggested that perhaps this is from Gamal's original church, and it's been reused in the building here. And it's been suggested as traces of text above the sundial there itself. Now, this medallion here has an animal carved into it. It looks similar to the ones we've seen around some church doors around the area, perhaps a bestiary. But it's obviously on quite a monumental scale. So perhaps this is reused masonry from an abbey. There's quite a few abbeys, nunneries, monasteries around this area, most of which were founded after this church and after the extensions were put on. However, there is one possible one, I think, Fulkholm Priory, which was a convent with a group of nuns and a prioress, dedicated in 1203 to St Stephen, but terminated around 1349, perhaps because of the Black Death. And so this perhaps could be one source of the stone here. Now, it looks to me like that is some sort of beast trying to look back over its shoulder to the left there. Now, in the Romanesque style, there's some foliated decoration coming out of its mouth and also a foliated tail, said to perhaps indicate paradise. I always wonder if these things coming out of the mouths are meant to be breath, and they sort of turn into foliage in a sort of breath of life type symbolism. But I don't know, that's just one of my theories. Now, this possibly could be a wolf. In the Anglo-Saxon and medieval bestiaries, they essentially collected images of real and mythical animals along with allegorical biblical texts and tales about them. Now, the wolf was said to be unable to bend or turn its neck and had to move its whole body to look behind it, and that could be what's being depicted here. The wolf was seen as an allegory for the devil, obviously leading sheep, people astray, devouring them, and obviously in a sheep farming community like this would have been quite pertinent symbolism. The wolf, it was said, was unable to look back over its shoulder and had to move its whole body to do so, as an allegory of the devil, or someone who was unrepentant of their sins, as the devil was. And it's sort of a metaphor for the dangers of falling into sin and not repenting. Now, also in the bestiaries, there's an element of the stories about wolves which refers to their tail, particularly the fluffy tuft of their tail, which was said to be a potent ingredient in love potions. And knowing this, a wolf that was in the last throes of its life would gnaw off the end of its tail so no one would come and collect it to use it in a love potion. And in fact, I think it's meant to be collected from a live wolf as well. So potentially this could be what we're seeing depicted down there with the foliated tail and then the foliated breath coming out of the wolf's mouth. Could be like the breath of the devil, the demon. So quite topical imagery still to this day in the sheep farming community as it would have been. Now, there is actually another sundial on the western side of the church tower, and you can just see it above the Anglian cross, and it's created by a series of lines which diverge from each other, so presumably to catch the evening hours of the sun as the sun migrates around the south to the west side of the church there. Now, ironically, the sun has gone in, it's starting to rain, so we'll head inside of the church. Now, before we even get into the church, we've got a wicket gate within this 12th century door. You can see, very low, you have to stoop to get in, and a step to get through. Now, wicket gates, you get in castles. You get the main gate, big gate, and then the wicket gate beside it, usually for pedestrians to go through. But sometimes you get wicket gates incorporated into the main door. In churches, you sort of see them in old colleges and things like that, and castles as well. So essentially it's to control the flow of people. It's defensive, so you're not allowing loads of people through at once, and horses and things like that. You have to duck and go through. Now, the concept of the wicket gate famously makes a feature in Bunyan's allegorical tale Pilgrim's Progress, and we looked a bit at Pilgrim's Progress when we visited the church at Skipwith, and if you're on YouTube you can see the video up here somewhere. And when the pilgrim is entering the celestial city on the first part of his journey, he enters through the wicket gate, and this is meant to reflect the concept that Matthew attributes to Jesus, talking about in chapter 7 of Matthew. Enter through the narrow gate, for wide is the gate and broad is the road that leads to destruction, and many enter through it. But small is the gate and narrow the road that leads to life, and only a few find it. So perhaps as well as being defensive, this is maybe allegorical. And it kind of makes me think of that tall, narrow entry door that we saw at Kirkdale, St Gregory's Minster, the original Anglo-Saxon door. So perhaps there's allegorical meaning in some of these entry points. Anyway, let's go in and have a look at the rest of the church. So why would somewhere like this need a wicket gate other than this allegorical meaning? There are some interesting texts that have survived to us, now held in the National Archives, from the Archbishop of Durham to King Edward II. They date to 1329, written in April and August of that year, complaining about commoners occupying, living in the church here at Leake. He complains once in April, trying to get them evicted, moved out, and then again in August, complaining that they're still there and that they're actually holding the church with arms and by force. So you have to put that into the context of the Scottish raids around this area in the 1320s, which decimated the village of Leake. So presumably all the wooden and thatched buildings were completely destroyed, and people had moved in to the church as a defensive stronghold. You've got a tower, a gate you could defend, and presumably there were people living here in the nave space of the church, which is quite an extraordinary thought, something you don't usually think about in the context of these churches, but they were being used as strongholds, it seemed, against the marauding Scots in that time. There's another letter from 1343 where the Archbishop of Durham complains about the state of the church. And the sheriff of the area is actually ordered to investigate as to whether the previous rector here has let it fall into ruin. And there's a new rectory established the very next year. Glebe lands and tithes are established, taxes on the local people and money coming in from the land essentially to pay for the fixtures and fittings in the church here. So this is the nave, is the original part of the church along the tower. And essentially you can see how the church has expanded with the growing population, particularly in the 13th century. As sheep farming became more and more important, people were moving into the area to work in on the farms with the sheep. So we can see the curved sort of early 13th century Norman arches, some fleur-de-lis on the capital over there, belying this sort of Norman Masonic tradition. And then on the far side, you've got the late 13th century, early English Gothic pointed arches. So you can see probably this aisle first, this aisle second, late 13th century. This side, you can see we've got some beautiful oak leaf capitals on top of the columns, beautiful little acorns, hexagonal columns on this side, rounded columns on the far side. Another telltale tale of the early 13th versus the late 13th century masonry. Now, there is a tradition in a lot of churches you read about that masons would carve their heads as a signature almost into their work. And we've got two carved heads in this late 13th century aisle on either end. These pew-ends here were made in 1519 by the Ripon School of Artisans. And if you go to Ripon Cathedral, you'll see very similar pew-ends, particularly up in the choir, where you get these weird and wonderful beasts that you can see similarly here. The beasts at Ripon are said to have inspired a young Lewis Carroll during his time there to write some of the weird and wonderful animals in his stories. But here we can see a depiction perhaps of St. John, but rather than being the Apostle John, it's thought that this is actually a depiction of John de Fwing, who was the prior of Bridlington Priory between 1320 and 1379, and then was canonised in 1401 and later became St. John of Bridlington. And he stands on a barrel at the bottom, also known as a tun, T-O-N, and on it is carved H-A-M-P, Hamp. So it's probably a surname of someone involved with the Priory, Hampton, a play on words for that. On the other side, the pew-ends on the other side have the cross trees of St. Peter here, and we've got H-A-R-D-E, Hard. There was a prior of Bridlington called Peter Hardy, so this could refer to him. Now, all of these pews have got beautiful poppy head carvings on the top, really beautiful foliage, and they've got these beasts on either end. The one here, interestingly, has no ears, and it's said anecdotally that one of the choristers here in the 1920s got sick of catching their robes on the ears, so he kind of hacks them off. Now, the other pew end to the other side is in a bit in slightly worse state than the other two. That's because it was rescued from a bonfire in a nearby village in the 1990s, and you can see the fire damage on it. It's slightly blackened, more eroded, and you can see the difference in the poppy heads when you compare the two next to each other. Now, on the other pew is a depiction of the armorial coat of arms of William de Gant, who was the founder of Bridlington Priory, 1137. But he commanded troops at the Battle of the Standard 1 year later, 1138, which was fought at Northallerton, not far from here. And he actually died at the Battle of the Standard in Northallerton in 1138. So this pew end is kind of a lasting memorial to him in a way, so it's lucky that it was rescued from the bonfire. Now, the church here is currently going through lots of renovation work, including, ironically, repairing of leaks in the roof. So, if you would like to donate to help the work of the church, I've been leaving the link down below, and you can go through to the church donation pages there. So, another fascinating church, more to come in the future, but until next time, keep church searching.